My name is Beatrice. I am 68 years old, and my occupation is a retired registered nurse. I was utterly devastated when my own flesh and blood secretly sold my forever home to cover his shameful casino debts, leaving me with absolutely nothing. The arrogant buyer arrived to change my locks, grinning like he had won the lottery. But his smile vanished when his phone rang, and the bank informed him that he had just paid the wrong son. For 40 years, I pulled exhausting double shifts at the city hospital. I held the hands of the sick and worked my feet to the bone, all to give my family a comfortable life. My greatest pride, besides my 2 boys, was my beautifully maintained, fully paid-off suburban home. I poured my absolute heart into raising my biological son, Jamal. I gave that boy every ounce of my unwavering love, thinking he would grow up to respect the sacrifices I made. I wanted him to have the world, but I never expected him to take mine. The peace I worked so hard to build shattered on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. I was out in the front yard, quietly pruning my prize-winning hydrangeas, enjoying the quiet of my retirement. Suddenly, a sleek, loud sports car pulled aggressively into my driveway. Out stepped Trent. He is the arrogant brother of my daughter-in-law, Chloe. Trent strutted up my walkway with a smug grin plastered across his face. Without a word of greeting, he tossed a heavy set of brass locks right onto my porch. They hit the wooden floorboards with a loud metallic clatter that made my chest tighten. He looked me up and down and smirked. He told me it was time to pack it up. He said Jamal sold him the house yesterday, and I had exactly 48 hours to clear out before he brought an eviction crew to throw my things on the curb. My heart dropped straight into my stomach. I stood there, clippers in hand, unable to breathe as the horrific truth washed over me. My youngest boy, the child I carried and nourished, had traded his mother's sanctuary just to cover his massive underground debts. Trent laughed at my silence, telling me a deal is a deal and that business is just business. He turned around and drove off, leaving me standing alone on the porch of a home I suddenly no longer owned. I felt a cold betrayal seep into my bones, a pain so deep it physically hurt to breathe. But as I stared at those locks on the ground, the sorrow disappeared, replaced by a quiet and burning resolve. My husband passed away when the boys were barely old enough to understand what death meant. I was a young widow, left with a mountain of bills and 2 little ones looking up at me for their every single need. I did not fold. I put on my scrubs, tied my shoes tight, and marched into the city hospital, pulling double shifts year after year. I scrubbed bedpans when the nursing assistants were short-staffed, held the hands of terrified patients, and rubbed my aching, swollen feet every night just to make sure there was hot food on our table and a solid roof over our heads. Tyrone came to me when my beloved sister passed away. I took him in without a second thought and raised him exactly like my own blood. Tyrone saw my daily struggle. He put his head down, studied late into the night under the dim kitchen light, and worked his way through a tough law school to become a sharp, highly respected corporate attorney. But Jamal, my biological son, was a completely different story. I suppose the deep guilt of him growing up without a father made me too soft. I babied that boy entirely too much. Whenever he faced a hurdle, I smoothed it out for him. Whenever he wanted a shortcut, I paved the way. I bailed him out of bad debts, paid off his maxed-out credit cards, and handed him my hard-earned savings to start businesses that never saw the light of day. I gave him everything out of a mother's blind, unconditional love, convincing myself that he just needed one more chance to find his footing. I refused to see that my endless giving was watering a weed of entitlement that would eventually wrap its sharp roots right around my throat. Then he married Chloe. Chloe was a white American woman who walked into my house as if she were doing me a massive favor just by stepping through my front door. She had this particular way of smiling at me that felt exactly like a physical slap across the face. During our Sunday family dinners, she would sip my sweet tea look around my perfectly clean living room and make these little passive-aggressive comments that cut deep. She would say things like, "Beatrice, this floral wallpaper is so quaint, it reminds me of a historical museum," or "Jamal, we really need to get your mother out of this outdated neighborhood. Her simple lifestyle is just too depressing for us to visit often." She never lifted a single finger to help me clear a plate or wash a dish, treating my beloved home like a cheap roadside diner and treating me like the hired help. Together, she and Jamal paraded around the city, putting on a grand show of extreme wealth. They pulled up to my humble driveway in leased luxury SUVs that cost more than my first mortgage. They bragged loudly about their extravagant vacations to overseas resorts, flashing high-end designer clothes and expensive watches. But a mother always knows when the math does not add up. I knew Jamal was only a mid-level manager, and Chloe barely kept a part-time job at a local clothing boutique. Their entire glamorous lifestyle was a fragile house of cards built on suffocating debt. They were drowning in monthly payments they could not afford, playing a pathetic game of pretend for strangers. And instead of tightening their belts, they started looking around for a lifeline. They started looking directly at me. The warning signs were all there, flashing like bright red sirens, but I willfully chose to shut my eyes. It started with small, disturbing things. A crisp $50 bill suddenly missing from my purse after they came over for dinner. Then came the frantic, desperate late-night phone calls from Jamal. He would call me at 2 a.m, his voice trembling and breathless, begging for emergency loans to cover a missed car payment or to keep their electricity from being shut off by the city. I always transferred the money to him, asking absolutely no questions. When they visited, I would catch them in the hallway, hissing at each other in hushed, aggressive tones. I could hear Chloe demanding to know when he was going to get the cash, calling him useless and weak, while Jamal desperately shushed her, glancing nervously toward the kitchen where I stood. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach every single time they walked through my door. The atmosphere grew thick with a toxic tension that made my chest physically ache. Yet I ignored my own gut feeling. I shoved those nagging doubts down deep into my soul, desperately wanting to believe the absolute best about my youngest boy, praying to God he would finally do the right thing. The mask finally began to slip just a few short weeks before the locks were changed on my own front door. I had spent all of Saturday preparing my famous pot roast and peach cobbler, expecting Jamal and Chloe for our usual Sunday dinner. They arrived 2 hours late and unapologetic, bringing with them that same heavy, suffocating tension. But that afternoon, Chloe did not even pretend to be a polite guest. While I was setting out the plates, she started pacing through my living room, running her hands along the beautiful crown molding my late husband had installed. She tapped her expensive designer heels against my original hardwood floors and spoke to Jamal as if I were utterly invisible. She pointed to the wall separating the dining room from the kitchen and loudly declared that they needed to take a sledgehammer to it. She said they could easily gut the entire kitchen rip out my custom oak cabinets and replace them with cheap modern fixtures to flip the property for a massive profit. My heart pounded so hard against my ribs, I thought it would burst. I dropped my serving spoon and marched right up to them, asking her exactly what gave her the right to talk about gutting my home of 40 years. I expected Jamal to defend me, to remind his wife that this was his mother's sanctuary. Instead, he let out a loud, condescending laugh. He placed his heavy hands on my shoulders and treated me like a confused toddler. He told me I was just mishearing things due to my old age. He insisted Chloe was only talking about a television show she had watched the night before, twisting reality to make me feel like my mind was slipping. He looked me right in the eye and said my hearing was failing, acting so incredibly concerned for my health, while Chloe smirked in the background. The pure gaslighting left me speechless and physically shaking. I swallowed my pride that afternoon and served them dinner in silence, but my eyes were finally wide open. I knew right then that their greedy intentions were real, and that they were measuring my home for a sale while I was still breathing inside it. 2 days after that miserable Sunday dinner, I decided to do a deep spring cleaning of Jamal's old childhood bedroom. I needed to keep my hands busy, to stop my mind from racing with terrible thoughts. I was clearing out the dark back corner of his closet, tossing out old shoeboxes and dusty junk he had abandoned years ago, when I stumbled upon a crumpled yellow legal pad. It was stuffed hastily inside a torn sneaker box, hidden away like a dirty secret. I pulled it out and flattened the wrinkled pages against my ironing board. What I saw on those yellow lines made my blood run absolutely cold. Page after page was covered in my own handwriting, or rather someone practicing my handwriting. There were dozens of attempts at my signature, tracing the exact curves and loops I had used to sign school permission slips and bank checks for decades. My heart hammered in my chest as I flipped to the final page. That was where the true depth of the nightmare revealed itself. Written in Jamal's messy scrawl were frantic calculations and astronomical numbers, accompanied by panicked notes about aggressive underground gambling debts. My son owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to very dangerous people who were clearly demanding immediate payment. Right below those terrifying numbers was the contact information for Trent Chloe's arrogant real estate flipping brother. Jamal had outlined a sickening back-alley deal in blue ink. Trent had agreed to pay off Jamal's dangerous gambling debts entirely under the table, keeping the shady bookies away from Jamal's front door. In exchange, Jamal was going to secretly transfer the deed of my fully paid-off house to Trent for a microscopic fraction of its actual market value. Trent wanted to steal my home for pennies on the dollar, and my own biological son was handing it over on a silver platter just to save his own skin. The sheer betrayal hit me so hard, my knees literally buckled beneath me. I sank onto Jamal's old twin bed, clutching that yellow legal pad to my chest as the room spun around me. My youngest boy, the child I had protected and provided for since his first breath, was actively practicing how to forge his own mother's signature to steal the roof from over her head. He was not just struggling financially like he always claimed. He was a reckless gambler, willing to sacrifice my safety, my security, and my entire life's work to cover up his shameful mistakes. I sat in that quiet room for hours, letting the devastating reality wash over me. I had spent 40 years of my life pulling double shifts at the hospital, wiping down beds, and missing out on my own youth to ensure he never had to struggle. His repayment for my lifelong sacrifice was a calculated scheme to leave me utterly destitute and homeless. But the tears refused to fall. Instead of breaking down into a puddle of grief, a sharp and quiet clarity washed over my mind. I knew I needed undeniable proof, something so concrete that they could never gaslight me or blame my age ever again. I was not going to be a helpless victim in the house I paid for with my own blood, sweat, and tears. The very next morning, I drove down to the local electronics store and purchased a small, high-definition, hidden nanny camera. It was designed to look exactly like an ordinary digital clock. I placed it discreetly on the bookshelf in my living room, angling the lens perfectly to capture a clear, wide view of the hallway closet, where I kept my heavy, fireproof safe. When Sunday rolled around, I put on my best church suit, grabbed my Bible, and loudly announced my departure, making sure Jamal and Chloe knew I would be gone for at least 4 hours. I drove to the church parking lot, but I did not go inside to hear the sermon. Instead, I sat alone in my car, holding my smartphone, staring at the live video feed broadcasting from my living room. I barely had to wait 20 minutes before my screen showed movement. The front door clicked open, and Jamal and Chloe crept inside my house like common thieves. My stomach churned with violent nausea as I watched my own flesh and blood sneak through the hallways of his childhood home. They marched straight to the closet, pulled out my heavy safe, and Jamal quickly punched in my security code. It was a code I had foolishly trusted him with years ago in case of sudden medical emergencies. He rummaged frantically through my private documents, tossing birth certificates and insurance policies aside, until he pulled out the thick, embossed envelope containing the original property deed. Chloe practically jumped with joy, clapping her hands together and kissing his cheek. Then, clear as day through the camera's built-in microphone, I heard my son speak the words that finally killed the last drop of maternal weakness left in my heart. He held my deed up to the light and told Chloe that once Trent wired the money, they would stick my mum in that cheap state-run facility downtown. He laughed a cruel and hollow sound and added that I was way too tired and too old to fight back against them anyway. I sat in my car staring at the glowing screen of my phone, listening to the child I birthed plan my absolute ruin. He did not care if I spent my final years rotting away in a neglected, underfunded facility. He only cared about saving himself, paying his debts, and keeping his luxury cars. In that small, quiet moment inside my vehicle, my overwhelming grief completely evaporated into thin air. The soft, forgiving mother who had babied him and bailed him out for decades died right there in the church parking lot. In her place rose a woman with cold, calculated determination. Jamal thought I was too tired to fight back. He thought my age made me weak, blind, and submissive. He was about to find out exactly how much fight a betrayed mother still had left inside her. I did not barge into my living room screaming. I did not shed a single tear. When a black woman has spent her whole life surviving panic is a luxury she simply cannot afford to entertain. Instead, I waited until they left the house, locking the door firmly behind them. Then I picked up my phone and dialed the one person in this world who truly understood the meaning of loyalty and protection, my older boy, Tyrone. I raised Tyrone from the time he was a scrappy 10-year-old boy after my dear sister passed away. He had none of Jamal's toxic entitlement. He put himself through a grueling law school by working exhausting night shifts and eventually became one of the most ruthless, brilliant corporate attorneys in Chicago. I told him everything. I described the forged yellow legal pad, the whispered, greedy conversations, and the horrific footage caught on my hidden living room camera. Tyrone was dead silent on the other end of the line for a very long time. It was the kind of icy, terrifying silence that told me he was already building an impenetrable courtroom case in his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice was remarkably composed, but the quiet, righteous fury beneath his words was absolute. He told me to breathe, and reminded me of the powerful secret we had locked away exactly 5 years ago. You see, when Jamal first started having aggressive money troubles, Tyrone saw the dangerous writing on the wall long before my motherly heart was willing to accept it. Tyrone had insisted we protect my assets from Jamal's reckless behavior immediately. Under Tyrone's strict legal guidance, I had quietly moved the deed to my home, along with a hefty retirement investment portfolio, into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. Tyrone was named the sole legal trustee. I was merely the beneficiary, living comfortably inside it. The brilliant reality of this legal arrangement was something Jamal had completely failed to realize in his frantic, arrogant scramble for quick cash. I did not own the property on paper anymore. The trust owned it. Jamal could forge my signature on 1,000 different real estate documents, but my signature held absolutely zero legal weight regarding the sale of that house. Tyrone explained that what Jamal was plotting was not just a family betrayal, it was a massive, documented federal felony. My heart steadied as Tyrone outlined the harsh legal reality. I felt a tremendous wave of relief wash over my tired bones. My oldest son promised me that no one would ever touch a single blade of grass on my property. He told me we were going to teach my youngest boy a lesson he would never, ever forget. We would let them dig their own permanent grave. Tyrone and I formulated a plan that required nerves of absolute steel. We decided to do absolutely nothing. We would let Jamal and Trent proceed right into their fraudulent back-alley real estate transaction. If we warned them early, they would just scatter like roaches when the kitchen light turns on, only to try another devious scheme down the road. We needed them to commit to the crime fully, to put their absolute greed on official, undeniable record. For the next 2 weeks, I played the part of the frail, unsuspecting mother to absolute perfection. I smiled warmly when Jamal and Chloe came over for Sunday dinner. I poured them cold, sweet tea and listened to their hollow, fake laughter, knowing exactly what they were orchestrating behind my back. Through the hidden nanny camera, I watched the final sickening stages of their plot unfold. I saw Jamal sit at my beautiful dining room table, while I was upstairs pretending to take an afternoon nap. I watched him pull a fake quitclaim deed from his expensive leather briefcase. He held his pen tight, carefully copying the signature he had practiced so desperately on that crumpled yellow legal pad. He forged my name with a steady hand, illegally transferring the ownership of my beloved home directly to Trent. Trent was equally blinded by his own toxic arrogance and unchecked privilege. My property sits in a highly sought-after established neighborhood and was easily appraised at $600,000. Trent genuinely believed he was the smartest man in the room, securing a beautiful, pristine suburban home for a mere $150,000. His overwhelming greed completely clouded whatever business sense he claimed to have. In a legitimate legal real estate transaction, any standard buyer would mandate a thorough title search and purchase basic title insurance. A routine title search would have instantly revealed that the property belonged to the irrevocable trust, not to Beatrice. But Trent was so incredibly eager to steal an elderly black woman's home for pennies on the dollar that he deliberately bypassed every standard legal procedure. He wanted the deal done quietly and quickly to keep his hands clean of Jamal's dangerous gambling debts. He felt completely untouchable, assuming my son had the absolute legal right to hand over my life's work. Trent thought he was getting the ultimate deal of a lifetime by keeping licensed attorneys and title companies entirely out of the picture. Tyrone monitored everything closely from his high-rise office in Chicago, using his vast legal connections to keep a strict eye on the public property records and financial wire systems. He called me the exact moment Trent finalized the fraudulent paperwork. Trent was so blindly confident in his scam that he wired the entire $150,000 directly into a dummy offshore account Jamal had set up just for this exact purpose. They honestly thought they had pulled off the perfect crime. They thought they had secured their glamorous fake lifestyle and wiped away Jamal's dangerous underground debts, leaving me as the ultimate collateral damage. They even posted pictures online, popping expensive champagne at an upscale restaurant downtown, celebrating their newfound wealth and my impending ruin. But Tyrone was already 10 steps ahead of them. The moment Trent authorized that massive wire transfer, Tyrone prepared the heavy legal hammer we had so carefully forged. He had the financial authority and the undeniable hard evidence to intercept their victory. He was just waiting for the absolute perfect moment to bring their entire world crashing down. I spent that final evening dusting my baseboards and shining my hardwood floors. I felt no fear at all. I felt a righteous, burning anticipation for the morning sun. This brings us right back to that bright Tuesday morning. The morning Trent pulled his flashy sports car into my driveway, strutted up my walkway, and tossed those heavy brass locks right onto my porch. He told me I had 48 hours to pack up my entire life before his eviction crew came to throw me out on the street. I did not flinch. I did not yell. I simply bent down, picked up my gardening clippers, and walked calmly up the steps to my porch. I took a seat in my favorite wooden rocking chair, smoothed out my floral skirt, and poured myself a tall glass of iced sweet tea from the pitcher resting on the side table. Less than 5 minutes later, a pristine white leased SUV came speeding down my quiet street. It parked aggressively right behind Trent's sports car, blocking my driveway completely. The doors swung open and out stepped my biological son, Jamal, alongside his wife, Chloe. They did not come empty-handed. Chloe was clutching a massive roll of heavy-duty black trash bags, her manicured nails gripping the plastic tight. She was practically vibrating with smug, unrestrained satisfaction. She strutted up my front lawn, looking like she had just conquered an empire, wearing an expensive silk blouse, bought with money they absolutely did not have. Jamal trailed slightly behind her, refusing to meet my eyes. He looked down at the freshly cut grass, his shoulders hunched, playing the part of the reluctant participant, even though he was the chief architect of my destruction. Chloe marched up the porch steps and planted her hands firmly on her hips, looking down at me as I rocked slowly in my chair. She used that same sickly sweet condescending tone I had endured for years. She told me it was time to be realistic, that my mind was clearly failing, and that they had graciously found a state facility downtown that would take me in by nightfall. She shoved the roll of black trash bags onto the small table next to my sweet tea, instructing me to start bagging up my clothes, because the new owner was not going to wait around. Trent stood off to the side, crossing his arms over his chest, grinning like a predator watching its prey. They formed a solid wall of intimidation right on my front porch. 3 arrogant individuals, fully convinced they had successfully cornered a vulnerable, helpless old woman. They expected me to break down crying. They expected me to drop to my knees, beg for mercy, and plead with my son to let me keep the home I had worked 40 years to build. But I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced tea. The condensation dripped down the cold glass, matching the absolute ice in my veins. I looked at Jamal, truly looking at him for the first time without the heavy blinders of a mother's enabling love. I saw him for exactly what he was. I did not say a single word to defend myself. I did not argue with Chloe or acknowledge Trent's arrogant smirks. I just rocked in my chair, listening to the gentle creak of the wood against the porch floorboards, watching the second hand on my wristwatch tick away. Tyrone had promised me the strike would happen exactly at noon. I checked my watch. It was 11:58. I took another sip of my tea, feeling the warm morning breeze against my face, perfectly content to wait for the timer to run out on their glamorous, wicked little lives. Trent marched up the last 2 steps of my porch, his face turning a blotchy red as he pointed a manicured finger right at my face. He demanded I get out of his chair and off his property this exact second, or he would physically drag me to the curb himself. Chloe stood right behind him, crossing her arms, her designer purse swinging on her shoulder, nodding along with her brother's cruel threats. Jamal just stared at the grass, too much of a coward to even look his own mother in the eye, while my home was supposedly being stolen. I did not move a single muscle. I just took another slow sip of my iced sweet tea. Right as Trent opened his mouth to yell at me again, the sharp ring of his cell phone pierced the heavy suburban air. He snatched it out of his pocket, annoyed by the interruption, and barked a harsh greeting. I watched closely as the colour completely drained from his arrogant face. The person on the other end of the line was not a friend or a business partner. It was the head of his bank's fraud department, and they had bridged a representative from my older son Tyrone's elite corporate law firm directly onto the call. I could hear the faint, tinny sound of the serious voice coming through the speaker. They informed Trent that the heavily discounted deed he was holding in his sweaty hand was nothing more than a worthless, fraudulent piece of paper. Trent started to stammer aggressively, arguing that he had just wired $150,000 to Jamal's account to secure the property. He insisted the transaction was perfectly legal. That is when Tyrone's colleague delivered the crushing blow. The voice on the phone firmly explained that Beatrice did not even own the house to sell it, as the property belonged to a secure, irrevocable trust. Furthermore, that massive wire transfer Trent had authorized was intercepted, frozen, and flagged by federal authorities the exact moment it hit the banking system. Tyrone had reported the felony wire fraud and forged documents the second the bank opened that morning. Trent's knees visibly buckled. He dropped his arm, the phone still pressed to his ear, as the bank representative delivered the final devastating sentence. The man stated with absolute icy precision that Trent did not buy a house today, he simply paid the wrong son. The sheer panic that washed over Trent's face was a masterpiece. He realized in a matter of seconds that his greed had blinded him to a massive criminal setup. He had tried to bypass the law to steal a lifetime of hard work from an elderly black woman. And now he was financially paralyzed and caught in the middle of a federal crime. I placed my glass of sweet tea on the small wooden table next to my rocking chair, folded my hands in my lap, and gave him the calmest, most satisfied smile a mother could muster. Before Trent could even catch his breath to form a coherent sentence, a sleek black town car turned smoothly onto our quiet street, followed closely by two marked police cruisers. The red and blue lights flashed brightly against the oak trees, drawing the immediate attention of every single neighbor on the block. Doors opened up and down the street as folks stepped out onto their lawns to witness the spectacle. Tyrone stepped out of his car, looking immaculate in his tailored charcoal suit, projecting absolute authority. He walked up the driveway with the two police officers flanking him, his eyes locked onto the people who had tried to destroy my life. Trent was hyperventilating now. He finally realized his $150,000 was gone frozen in a federal investigation, and he was deeply implicated in a felony real estate scam. Survival instinct kicked in, and Trent violently turned on his own family. He lunged toward Jamal, grabbing him by the collar of his expensive shirt, screaming at the top of his lungs that Jamal and Chloe had intentionally scammed him. He yelled that they set him up to take the fall for their gambling debts, completely abandoning his smug composure. Chloe shrieked desperately, trying to pull her brother off her husband, her flawless facade crumbling into absolute hysteria. She burst into loud, ugly tears, begging the police officers to understand that it was all a simple misunderstanding. But the officers ignored her frantic cries. Tyrone handed the lead officer the thick folder containing the forged deed, the financial traces, and the crystal-clear audio and video recordings from my hidden living room camera. The officer took one look at the evidence and approached Jamal. Right there on the manicured front lawn I had watered and tended to for 40 years. They forcefully turned my youngest son around and placed him in cold steel handcuffs. The distinct click of the metal locking around his wrists echoed in the heavy air. The officer read Jamal his rights loudly, declaring that he was being arrested for felony forgery, grand theft, and severe elder financial abuse. Chloe fell to her knees in the grass, sobbing wildly. Her luxury purse spilling its contents across the sidewalk, utterly ruined in front of the entire neighborhood. I finally stood up from my rocking chair. I smoothed down my skirt, walked slowly down the porch steps, and approached the police cruiser where Jamal was being held. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a sudden desperate terror. He looked exactly like the little boy who used to scrape his knee and cry for me to fix it. He pleaded with me, begging me to tell Tyrone to drop the charges, crying that he was my son and that I was supposed to protect him. I looked him dead in the eyes, feeling no anger, only a profound and heavy peace. I told him clearly that a mother's love is truly unconditional, but her wallet is most certainly not. I explained that I had given him every opportunity in the world to be a good man, but he chose greed, and now he had to pay the price for his own wicked choices. I stepped back and stood tall beside Tyrone. My older son placed a strong protective arm around my shoulders as we watched the officers guide Jamal into the back of the squad car. Chloe was placed in the second cruiser, her wails echoing down the street as their luxurious fake lifestyle was completely dismantled and destroyed. Trent was left standing on the sidewalk, pacing furiously as he yelled into his cell phone, realizing he was now facing massive federal legal battles with a completely frozen bank account. They had all tried to bury me, thinking I was just a tired old woman. But as I watched those police cars drive away, taking the toxicity out of my life forever, I knew I had never been stronger. I had protected my sanctuary, and justice was finally served. It has been 2 peaceful years since that chaotic morning on my front lawn. I now spend my golden years surrounded by genuine love and absolute tranquility. I still live in my beautiful, fully paid-off suburban home, but these days the walls echo with the joyful laughter of Tyrone and his wonderful family. They visit me constantly, treating me with the profound respect and deep cherishing that every mother truly deserves. I watch my 2 beautiful grandchildren run across the very same grass where my biological son tried to orchestrate my ruin, and my heart feels completely whole. Through this agonizing ordeal, I learned the most painful but valuable lesson a mother can ever learn. You can give a child your absolute last breath, but if pure greed lives inside their heart, they will still bitterly complain that you did not leave them enough air. I spent 40 long years enabling Jamal, believing my endless sacrifices would buy his loyalty. I was wrong. I finally understand that setting firm and unyielding boundaries is absolutely never an act of cruelty. Setting those strict boundaries is truly the greatest and most necessary form of self-love a mother can ever practice. To all my beautiful queens out there listening to my story today, please never let anyone, absolutely not even your very own flesh and blood, make you a stranger in your own home. Have you ever had to set a hard boundary with a toxic family member? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below right now. Please do not ever forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Stay blessed, stay vigilant, and I will see you in the next story.